So happy to see people from so many countries: Benin, London, Nigeria. Welcome, guys.
Ooh, hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed the music so far. I think we've got enough people to get started now. So thanks everyone for sharing your experiences. Looks like we have people from all over Senegal, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Kenya, lots of different roles: teachers, coaches, product designers, ed tech, um, again, facilitators. Really cool. So thanks everyone for joining to the Design and Education webinar hosted by YUX. And here we're going to share our insights on designing engaging learning experiences. So this is the last in our series this half of the year of vertical specific webinars. We've had some on agri-tech, health, and gender. And there's going to be more activities to come in the second half of the year, which I believe David will be sharing about. And for this webinar, we're really excited to collaborate with our communication. We have Education Design Unlimited, and Clara will be able to speak more about them. We also have the Aga Khan Foundation. So get to know each other a little bit. Just briefly, and then our speakers will be able to talk in a bit more detail during their actual talks. So here are our speakers for today. You have myself. My name is Rajay Shah, and I'm a senior UX researcher and also the education vertical lead at YUX. I'll be able to talk about that more during my talk. And then we also have Clara Muthoni Njeru, a researcher and project designer from Education Design Unlimited. And we also have Inés Alvarez-Gortari, a strategic designer at ThinkPlace UK. So thanks again to Clara and Inés, some really amazing and talented researchers and designers who are willing to share their experiences with us today. So I'll quickly go through the agenda. Firstly, we'll have Inés talking through nurturing design research capacity in the field. We then have Clara talking about lean evidence generation using learning sprints. And then I'll speak about business development and resources. Just some housekeeping rules for the session today. Kindly keep your mic muted and drop your questions in the chats. We'll go through each of the presentations. The speakers will talk for about 20 minutes each. But please, ask as many questions as you want within the chat. So we have a team who'll be looking through them and sharing, moderating a Q&A session at the end. We'll make sure to have at least 20 to 30 minutes for that. We can also open your mic to clarify if you need to clarify any of your questions during that time. So now I'll hand it over to David, who will share a little bit about YUX.
Thank you, Rajay. Hello, everyone. My name is David Shamavu. I'm Program Assistant at YUX Academy, and now I'll be briefly talking about what is YUX and its academy. So YUX is an African research and design company specialized in user experience and human-centered design. The company mainly focuses on incorporating the African perspective in the user experience of African products and services. Our vision at YUX is committed to making design and research accessible to the African continent. So as we can see in the next slide, over the years, YUX has grown from a small community of thinkers. As you can see in the next slide, yes, YUX has grown from a small community of thinkers in 2016 to now in a Pan-African community with about 45 full-time employees in different countries on the continent. Can we please see the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. And so, like over the years, we have worked with many, like I was saying that we, no, slide before, sorry. Um, Three.
Sorry, David. I think I'm going
Okay.
to have to switch my internet.
Okay, cool.
Is
The one before?
you able to share your screen while I should just 2 minutes?
Yeah. But you should unshare the screen for me to share it. You can just start the previous slide. But it's okay. I can just start.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah,
Hey.
I think you should unshare your screen for me to share it.
Okay, I've switched my internet. Is this better for everyone?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry, David. Okay, now you can go ahead. I wasn't able to hear you earlier. Just let me know which to share.
The one before.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Sorry about that. So I was saying, like, over the years, UX has grown up from a small community of thinkers in 2016 when it was founded to now into a Pan-African community with about 45 full-time employees who work in different African countries in the continent. So over the years, we have worked with also large tech companies and organizations such as Google, Wikimedia, and Meta. However, we still have a primary focus on local startups as well, such as My Agro, Affinity, Stitch, because we believe that this is where our mission shines best. And as you can see in the following slide, with our company, we promote building partnership with collaborating and sharing our knowledge as well as our experiences. So in our UX Academy, we primarily focus on three main things. First, we have trainings where we deliver in-person, hybrid, as well as remote trainings. Secondly, it's about community. Here, we keep contact with our alumni by organizing alumni programs as well as events to still stay in collaboration with them. Thirdly, we have resources where we organize webinars and master classes to share our experience learned. And this current webinar actually, it is one about design education, falls under the resource domain of our academy. And as you can see in the following slide, we'll also have some other events that we're going to plan for the rest of the year. So for July, we have a Meetup Uganda event. In August, it will be the same thing, but for Ghana. And then in September, we have an orientation event, which will be mainly about understanding design professions. And lastly, in October, we'll have a user experience researcher cohort for women only, but which will be in French. Now, I'll hand it over to Inés, who will talk about the first part of the webinar.
Thank you so much, David and Rajay and the whole UX team for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. I'm super excited to share some lessons that I've learned when it comes to nurturing design research capacity in the field. And I'm also looking forward to Rajay's and Clara's presentations afterwards. So before I introduce myself, let me just quickly walk you through the sections of my talk. So Raj, if you just go in the next slide. So I'll start off with some key points to consider when designing the learning journey of your researchers. Now, when I talk about researchers, I'm talking about local researchers that your organization hires or your client hires to help you conduct field research. And usually these researchers, they're hired locally, and they can either do the research themselves, they're part of your sort of field team, and they will also be conducting interviews and focus group discussions, or they can also just have a more supportive role, and they take notes when you're conducting research, and they can also act like, your thought partner when it comes to debriefing about your different, the different findings that you see during your interviews. They can often also act like interpreters, especially if you don't speak the language of the context where you're working. It's important to have them on board. So yeah, so I've this has been like a big journey for me in terms of learning how to conduct research in the field. And so I thought it would be useful to share these learnings with everyone here. So a little bit about myself. Next slide, Rajay, please. So I'm a designer at ThinkPlace since 2019. I'm not formally trained as a designer. I have a background in geography and urban planning, and I did a lot of work in Brazil, where I worked in a grassroots civil society organization that advocated for better transport and sanitation. And then I transitioned into design sort of professional career 4 years ago that landed me in Kenya. And I got to work at ThinkPlace in a lot of interesting projects. ThinkPlace is a design and innovation company. It was founded in 2005. And we work with driving behavior change, and we work in a lot of complex topics in different sectors such as nutrition, sanitation, health, education. And right now I'm in the UK office. So I worked in the Kenya office for 3 years, and now ThinkPlace has opened a UK office. So I am now in the UK, and that's why I'm also joined from the UK. And I see there's some people from the UK as well in this webinar. Okay, next slide. If I can just give you a little flavor of the type of work that I've done when I was at ThinkPlace Kenya. I'm not going to go into them because I just don't have time to go into each project, but the main point of these projects, of this work that I've done, is very complex projects. Also, I should point out that none of them are tech-based. So I haven't worked in any tech-based projects. They've always been offline projects. And all of these different projects have required me to talk to all sorts of people, a lot of them having opposing views on the same problems. So for example, I've spoken to midwives in Mali, doctors, but also pregnant women and their husbands and their families. And, there's a lot of lack of trust between these different actors. Similarly in Uganda, so the project that took place in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, I did the research in Uganda, and there was a big lack of trust between the teachers and the parents and also the students. In Ethiopia, the project was about trying to accelerate the elimination of female genital mutilation. And as you all know, female genital mutilation is a super taboo subject. A lot of the time, many people aren't even comfortable to admit that they do engage in this practice. But I think with the right sort of mindset and really putting everything in place so that your participants feel comfortable talking to you, and that includes making sure that the researchers that you're working with are also putting everything in place to make participants feel comfortable talking to them, we can get people to open up about very sort of taboo subjects. Like for example, in this project, the photo actually was a focus group discussion with women who were very comfortable talking about how they practice FGM, and they, it's part of their culture, and it was a very fascinating conversation. So so let me share with you first a little scenario. So next slide, Rajay, please. Okay, so I want you to imagine the following situation. You are a busy designer or a UX researcher working on a project for which you're going to go to a rural place in, I don't know, let's say Ethiopia, and you're going next week, and you have a lot of preparation to do. You're preparing your materials, your schedule, your research questions, your travel plans, you're packing your suitcase, and you just know that there will be 2 local researchers at your destination, and that when you get there, you will have half a day, or maximum maybe 1 day, to get to know them, to explain to them what the research will be about and what the project is trying to achieve. And you will be working with these 2 researchers nonstop for 6 days. So you arrive to Ethiopia and you meet the 2 local researchers. They have a master's degree and are very experienced in conducting qualitative research, but they have never heard of human-centered design. Now, does this sound familiar? Have any of you been in any sort of similar situation before, where you go to the field and you've never met your researchers before? Yeah, I'd just like to understand a bit the audience today. If you guys want to put in the reactions box a little green tick to say if you have been, if this sort of rings a bell, or if you have any sort of experience in what I'm saying. Or in the chat, yep, I see a few people saying yes, 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 very much so. Cool. So yeah, this sounds very familiar. So the question is, given your local research skill set and your approach to human-centered design and your design challenge, how might we empower local researchers to conduct design research in the best possible manner? What do they need to know to be able to do this? So this is where being intentional about how you sort of, onboard researchers on the human-centered design process is super important. Next slide, Rajay, please. Okay, so I'm just going to share with you some key considerations. Every design company has a certain way of doing design research, and it's important that, like I say, that we're intentional about training local researchers. First thing to take into account is who are your researchers and what is their level of experience. Are they highly educated individuals with master's or PhD students who are experienced at conducting qualitative research, or are they really young, women and men with no formal education degrees? I've worked with both profiles, and it's important to approach HCD differently depending on who they are. For example, someone who's an experienced qualitative researcher might be super helpful to explain to them the key differences between what traditional qualitative research is and what, human-centered design research is. And I usually like telling researchers that HCD is just one more tool in their toolbox. Secondly, consider what is their role going to be? Are they going to be conducting research activities themselves, or are they going to be supporting you in your research activities? Such as, for example, are they going to be translating for you? Because if they're going to be translating for you, it's also important for you to intentionally, show them good techniques for translations, bad techniques for translations. For example, it's super important to translate in the first person. So if someone says, I went to school yesterday, the translation should say, I went to school yesterday, and not say, oh, he said that, he went to school yesterday, So just being very intentional about that. And then thinking about, what is it exactly that they need to know in order to provide the best outputs? Because you could talk about so many things about human-centered design, but you have 6 days, you need to be targeted, you need to give them the most useful information. And that's where I usually focus on the training objectives on the right. So the HCD mindset, especially focusing on empathy and curiosity. And I usually talk about the golden rules when conducting interviews, for example, which is to have a beginner's mindset, to show empathy and to show curiosity and to, ask questions. And then the interviews, focus group discussions, observations, and synthesis. So synthesis is when, we get together and we make sense of the findings of the day to start unpacking different insights. And what can you learn from them? So this is not a one-way process where you illuminate people about everything you know. It's a two-way process where they have a lot of knowledge as well, not just contextual. And again, this is especially true if they're going to be, from the communities where you're working, but they will also have useful knowledge in terms of how to approach people, or even some research techniques that they may have that you might find interesting. So those are the key things that I like to keep in mind. But the point is, they must, the point is to have the humility to be open, to see your researchers as someone that you can learn from. Next slide, Rajay, you were right with the timing. Okay, so training is an iterative journey, I think, as everyone here who works in education knows. It's not just a one-off tick boxing exercise. And the really cool thing about being several days in the field with your researchers is that you can iterate and you can provide live feedback, and you can, they can also give feedback on you. So it's really a chance, it's a golden opportunity to apply, reflect, learn, and improve the practice. So I'm just sharing here some very quick tips on, things to think about before the field work, during and after. So before the field work, I think it's super important to break the ice. Usually, if possible, it's good to spend, I like to spend a whole day, but if it's not possible because of budget or whatever, then at least half a day. And I think it's important to invest time in breaking the ice with the researchers and getting to know them informally. You know, who are they? What do they like? What are they used to? What are they motivated by? And I find that sometimes ice-breaking activities are really useful in that. Like, for example, card games. I don't know if you've come across like empathy cards that have like personal questions, and you sort of play a game and people share information about themselves, or getting people to draw a picture of themselves to introduce themselves. That usually is good because everyone says that, you know, they can't draw, and so everyone laughs at each other's pictures. So it's good to break the formal tone by bringing in a fun activity. Then I onboard the researchers onto the purpose of the assignment that we're going to do together. I usually explain the project background, the objectives, and why the research is necessary to achieve the project objectives. And I keep things very simple because I don't want to overload them with information. Then I talk about the HCD mindset, and I find that the best way to talk about the HCD mindset is to actually demonstrate it and to show it, usually through activities. So for example, with your two local researchers, if you ask them, okay, can you design the ideal holiday for your colleague? And they'll go about sort of very seriously, you know, doing their ideal package for their holiday, and then they sort of presented, but then it's like, oh, but the other person doesn't like what the person designed for them. And so the main point is to show them, you know, then I ask them prompting questions, but did you ask them what they want? What things do people like doing in their free time? And so that's sort of when they start getting into the whole mindset of like, oh, right, okay, yeah, it's all about understanding people's needs and their pain points and their pleasure points. And yeah, it's just that shift in mindset that you're there to understand people, not to judge them. Then it's always good to set expectations for the field work. Field work is going to be intense. I'd also like to hear thoughts, because sometimes, I don't know if I'm the only one doing this, but I don't think so. I think for everyone, field work is messy, it's long, it's very tiring. There's the interviews, then there's the daily synthesis. So there will be long working hours, maybe like 12-hour days, which is not ideal, maybe 10. But yeah, it's good to sort of set those expectations from the beginning, and also to co-design a code of contact, especially when you're working in more extreme circumstances where maybe you have to travel a lot and it's tiring and you're hungry and you haven't had a chance to have proper lunch, you've just been snacking. Like, people can get kind of impatient and maybe in a bad mood. So it's always good to be mindful about that. And also important to discuss communication styles. So like, how do you want me to give you feedback? Like, do you want me to give you feedback in the moment, or do I wait until a quiet moment? And I think that's useful to sort of start building in that team cohesion. And then finally, I spend as much time as I can practicing research techniques. So for example, you know, what's a good and a bad introduction for an interview? So we have a discussion on like the good characteristics of good and bad interviewing techniques. And then I get them to practice like actual role play. And I find that role play is super useful to getting the message across. But then, so that's day one. Then the fun starts during the field work. And that's when we're conducting interviews, we're facilitating focus group discussions, we're observing participants. It's always good to have regular debriefs, whether it's sort of during lunchtime or in the evening, about how each interview or discussion went. And it's good because you have live examples fresh in your mind about you know, what the research did that day and what they can improve on, but also you yourself like providing an example of your own work and of what you could have done better. So it's important to not just give people feedback, but also be self-critical yourself. And daily synthesis. Sometimes you can be very tired to do daily synthesis after a long time interviewing people, for example, but it's super necessary because it's when you have information fresh in your mind. And I like to use two very simple frameworks, Rajay, which you can go to the next slide. The first framework is this, I call it like a learning framework, where these 4 simple questions really sort of help you to, well, you and the researchers to pick out, okay, what did I learn? and what surprised me, and what worked, what didn't work in my research methods, and what are new questions that come to mind. Again, this doesn't necessarily need to be filled out religiously every day, but it's good to have discussion and to take notes of this. Then a second tool, which is in the next slide, is what I call the CAD tool, which is the certainties, assumptions, doubts. Now, it's interesting because this is where you find the complementary knowledge bases that you're bringing together as a team, because your local researchers, for your local researchers, maybe some things are a complete certainty when in fact it's an assumption. And for you, maybe something is an assumption, but it's a complete certainty. But yeah, so it's always useful to look at your findings and clarify, okay, what are we sure about? What are we assuming? And what are we doubting? And this helps uncover further topics that we need to dig deeper. You know, tomorrow we should ask the teachers about this. So it's important to be reflective about what you're finding out every day. If we can go back to the 2 slides, just to the journey, Rajay. That one, yeah. So yeah, that's very intense, but it's iterative, the during phase, and it's a steep learning curve for everyone. So that's why it's important to set the basics from the start, where we're talking about, you know, what are the communication styles, what are our expectations, and yeah, and then afterwards, it's always good to provide space for reflection so that researchers also think about what they learned that week. You think about what you've learned that week, what went well, what could improve. And so, yeah, it's hard to be intentional sometimes, especially if it's very, you know, it's a very tiring 1 week of work, but it pays off in the end. So those are the sort of main things for designing the learning journey of your researchers when it comes to conducting fieldwork. Now I'm going to talk about common challenges and how to mitigate them. So common things that I've come across that researchers do that is good to sort of pick up in the moment. For example, in terms of empathy, one of the things that I've come across is having researchers, you know, be with me in an interview, and they introduce themselves in a way that completely reinforces power relations. And the thing is, first impressions, as we know, matter so much. And so you really need to make participants feel comfortable from the start. So I've had people, research assistants, for example, just, you know, say things like, oh, hello, my name is Dr. This, and I'm here for this research project, and I need to talk to you about this, and I want to have answers about that. And it's just not the way to do it. There's so many things that go wrong in that introduction. So again, it's good to sort of demonstrate, listen, when you introduce yourself, it's good for you to sort of, first of all, you know, thank the participant. Thank you for your time, and introduce yourself in very simple terms. So yeah, just giving that sort of feedback. Another thing that researchers do is to express judgment of the participant, even if it's in the best intention. So for example, during an interview, I remember an adolescent was explaining why he had dropped out of school, and the local researcher said, oh, but you should really try to go back to school. You know, it's so important that you finish school. That's when afterwards, I mean, you don't do this in the interview, but then afterwards you say, listen, you're not supposed to do that. Your job is to understand people's lives and their perspectives. So suspending judgment is often hard. And I often give the example of female genital mutilation, where I also have worked with doctors who have been my research assistants or my local researchers. And they, you know, having someone say, oh no, female genital mutilation, oh, it's not that bad, you know, and they're like, why? What do you mean? The tone of voice is important also, like when you're to show that you're showing judgment. Instead of, no, what do you mean? It's like, oh, what do you mean, you know? And same with expressing judgment of questions. Sometimes I've had researchers judge my questions as well in front of the research participant. So again, giving that feedback on wait until the end for you to give me any sort of feedback. In terms of curiosity, we always say that it's important to ask why. So common things is, you know, researchers sticking too much to the questions guide, or just accepting what the participant is saying without asking further. Oh, but why? But how come? But oh, when you mentioned this, how come this? So yeah, next slide, Rajay. So in terms of very quick tips, I always tell researchers, like, when you're interacting with people, it's super important to use simple language and to introduce yourself in a very simple manner, to thank participants for their time, acknowledging that, you know, participants are busy and they could be doing so many other things than talk to you. And also when you ask participants to help you, I think that switches the power dynamics as well. So yeah, it's like participants are, when you ask participants, can you help me understand this? It gives them that sort of decision to be like, okay, yes, I do want to help you. And like I've mentioned, it's important to be mindful of voice tone, be mindful of body language, be mindful of spatial arrangement. So I tell researchers, you know, if we're going to someone's house and you see them taking their shoes off, you take your shoes off as well. Or a lot of the times I've had participants, research participants, sort of give us the chair and they sit on the floor, and we say, no, like, we want you to be comfortable. So you sit on the chair and we sit on the floor. And again, like I say, tone of voice is super important in how you ask questions and how you show that curiosity and that empathy. And it's important to go beyond the research guide. I think, yeah, it's common to say that the best interviews are usually the ones that feel like honest conversations. And yeah, it's important to ask why while being mindful of your voice tone. Now, wrapping it up. So next slide, Rajay. So I need to wrap this up. So very key takeaways. So the whole point of training researchers is that by doing so, you're going to increase the quality of the research outputs. You're going to make the researchers feel valued. You're going to increase the team motivation and cohesion. And you're going to offer an opportunity to learn human-centered design in a practical, hands-on manner. And I think importantly also, you leave a legacy, because you're leaving behind people from the community who can now conduct or have an experience with human-centered design research that can also help them, you know, conduct other assignments in the future, but also understand their communities from like maybe a more empathetic way, and sort of appreciating the complexity of different issues that their communities face. And also more selfishly, if you have to go back to the place to do research, you know, you have people there who can really help you. Finally, next slide, Rajay. As I said, as a field lead, you're there to learn as well. It's a two-way process. And it's super important that you leverage researchers' insider knowledge. It's like, you know, your researchers can also be like your cultural informants. So you can ask them all these questions like, oh, but why do people behave this way? And what's the importance of that? And how come that man was wearing this kind of clothes or whatever? It's important you also draw out as much contextual information as you can, so that you're also learning. And leverage the power of role play. I honestly think role play is the way to go when you're trying to get messages across with your research assistants. So yeah, I didn't do that much. I was going to do a bit of role play today, but I was like, I don't have that much time. But yeah, that's super big learning tip that I've learned in terms of how to make sure that I'm communicating human-centered design research methods to the researchers. Ultimately, fieldwork is super stressful. So it's important you check your team's temperature, their energy levels, their motivation. There's no point in saying, we need to do this. Like, if your team is tired, then don't force it either. It's important to prioritize team well-being as well. It pays off in the end. If you can't do the daily synthesis that evening, then just do it tomorrow morning. That's okay. It's important to have that team cohesion. And yeah, I could talk about so much of this topic, but I don't want to bore you and I don't want to go overboard. I'm always happy to learn about anyone's experience in this. I've shared my sort of main tips, but there's so many other things we could talk about regarding this topic. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to continue this conversation, although we'll also have a Q&A session afterwards. So thank you very much, everyone. And over to Clara.
Thank you so much, Inés. Those really great insights. I'm taking notes as well. for my fieldwork. First, thank you, Rajay, and the UX team for inviting me to be a part of the conversation today. My name is Clara Muthoni Njeru, and I'll be speaking a little about lean evidence generation, and specifically about learning sprints, and share examples from 2 projects that I've worked on, one a few years ago and one more recently. Rajay, if you could please go. Yeah, so my current role is a researcher and product designer at Education Design Unlimited. Education Design Unlimited is a research firm, a learning design firm that is based in Nairobi. We support organizations to use evidence in their project and product development. A little about my background. I've previously worked in edutainment, in product management and production of animation, all in education. And my background is computer science. So as you see my examples, I'll give a bit an example based on my work in developing products for children that are tech-based. I've listed here a few of the examples that I've worked on in the past 6 months, and some of our work in EDU. So you'll see lots of research in education, all education, tech-based, parental engagement. I heard Inés mentioning something around that would be interesting for me to hear more about. If we could go to the next slide, please, Raj. Oh, sorry, that was a picture of me hiking, and I was reminded today on my phone. I was like, yeah, when I'm not doing fieldwork, I try hike on the previous slide, sorry. So what's a learning sprint? A learning sprint is defined, the proper definition is a forecasting, like has a specific goal to support the development or of a product or the iteration of a program implementation. So it's time bound. Maybe that's very, very specific. There's 2-week sprints, there's 6-week sprints. I've tried both for different projects. And the goal is that you gather data quickly, you test the assumptions you have about a product or about a program, and then you validate. You can also use this to validate hypotheses that you have, and leverage existing knowledge from some of your stakeholders that you already have. If it's a new product, from potential users, and collaborate to help it, to come up with usable insights that will inform your product or program iteration. I'll give an example of 2 ways that I've used learning sprints. One that is informed by the product. So we test, learn, and adapt the product, and where we've used a learning sprint to we test, learn, and adapt to the problem in the place where we're implementing a project. In the examples that I'll share, you'll see how these differentiate. This is an interesting for me, even for me as I was preparing for this. I was like, this is interesting to think about, because they relate in many ways. They're similar in many ways, but if you are building a product, for example, a mobile application or a game, then you're likely going to start with a feature on the product. Whereas if you have a big project and you can't overhaul the whole project, you want to test particular assumptions that target a particular program detail at a given time. So again, because they're time bound, 2 weeks, for example, or 6 weeks, then you want to test something small in a localized place, for example, in one school or in a few schools before you proceed to the next one. We'll see how these examples have come up in my work from the next slide, for example. So when I've used learning sprints to adapt a product, process that I use is start with planning, or where the backlog or to-do list from user testing will inform part of that planning, and then build the product, ship or make the product available to users, measure where the user research team will then jump in and say, for example, we'll measure by looking at the data from the application, or measure by going to the field and looking at users using the product, and this informs the iteration or the to-do list for the next sprint. So in the example that I keep going back to, where we're building a game, and we can see that in the next slide, Raj, please. Building a game for children. The game is supposed to teach children how to read by introducing them to the letters. They learn to trace the letters. They learn the letter sounds, learn to trace the letters and the names of the letters. And in the game, with the onboarding process was that you when you start the game, you go to the first letter, because it's targeted at children, no sign up process for the children, so very easy onboarding. And in this particular sprint, we're trying to see how can we make more children get to the third level, or when they like what is inhibiting their use of the game when they start the game or they download the game for the first time. So we tested by some of the things that we were planning to do was, for example, remove obstacles on the ground. So it was it's a running game. Children are running, or there's a character running on the game, catching letters, and users would keep missing, and you'd lose all lives, and it became frustrating. So the to do on this particular sprint was to remove the obstacles and repeat the instruction after 15 seconds, and then show the letter that the user has unlocked, so that like motivation for, see, you've come this far. This was a 2-week sprint, so we'd keep checking on each day how the team is doing in terms of development. The success metric for us was ease of the user playing the game. When a new user downloads the game, how far do they go? But watching them play, are they frustrated? What are their like facial expressions? What excites them? Are they are they enjoying the game? And maybe I should say, initially we had tested the pedagogy to make sure that children were actually learning, and now we were only working on the usability of the game to make it more interesting. We did these sprints, many of them. Eventually we had a story at the beginning of the games to engage learners, a story about what they're going to play in that particular game, or what the adventure is. Introduce the adventure using a short story, and then get on the game. And after a few years, these developed into a full animated series. So the stories became the testing. The short stories, 15-second short stories, became the testing. Like we said, testing that for the full animated story. So the sprints were part of a longer development process or a product roadmap, but they continuously were built to support more user engagement or and make learning fun for children. The other process that I've used, learning sprint, and this is more recent, was using a learning sprint to adapt to a problem. In this situation, I can mention the name of the project here because it's a current project. So the project is called K-Play, and here we can think of the blue bit, the intervention. That's the whole K-Play project, which is a learning through play project that is being implemented in 2 counties in Kenya, and EDU is supporting the project through research. And our work was to test or to think through with the implementation organization what assumptions we still have about the project, what aspects after 2 years of implementing the project, what aspects of the project are still not working okay, and we picked one, and that informed the sprint design and the way we were going to learn or was through speaking to users early, and then going to experts, quote unquote, on the subject matter, and that is now informing how we are implementing the communities of practice in the project. I'll speak a little bit more about in the next slide. So like I'm saying, K-Play is a learning through play project, and we strengthen or support teachers in schools to implement the competency-based curriculum that is in implementation in Kenya. One of the things that we have always had in the project was communities of practice. Communities of practice amongst teachers learning from each other, which is something that teachers always do, but are not defined in that sense. Communities of practice, the community, they're not. There's no structure to how to run the communities of practice. So when K-Play introduced them, teachers still didn't understand how they were supposed to do it. And so after 2 years of project implementation, we realized it was one of the weakest bits of the project. So we designed the sprint with the goal to strengthen the practice in schools. The critical belief was based on the bigger goal of the project, that if we strengthen communities of practice or COPs in schools, then teachers will improve their practice in the classroom or use more learning through play pedagogies in the classroom. The minimum proof that we worked with was evidence of best practices in a localized context. So speak to teachers first, understand what they know about communities of practice, what works, what limitations they have, and then speak to experts and hear what has worked in Kenya, in particular in Kenya or other African countries that have the same context. Next slide, please, Raj. Thank you. So like I'm saying, yeah, we spoke to teachers and we gathered what they, our assumptions was that they already know about communities of practice because it's something that is mentioned in the basic education framework in Kenya. But most of the teachers, I'd actually say younger teachers, had not been part of a community of practice because that has not been, the government has not had active projects around communities of practice. So they were aware about the concept, but then they did not know how to go about it. The other challenges included the workload. So because of their workload, they're not able to make time for the way a community of practice is described in our program. And a few other challenges, including digital skills, because the community of practice that we described included having Zoom meetings and sharing resources through WhatsApp. So as we were going to, thank you, Raja, we can move to the next one. As we were going to the communities of practice experts, then we went with these challenges in particular, saying these are our challenges. Have you faced the same, and how have you how have you navigated? For the engagement or learning session with different individuals implementing communities of practice in programs, including learning with play projects in Kenya, we used Lego Serious Play, which is a research methodology or evidence gathering methodology where you build models to describe your structure of a community of practice or learning or professional learning community, and there was a full day of engaging with each other without specifically like digging into we're talking about the Lego pieces and not your project, which we found very interesting, and were able to gather a lot of information from them and learn from each other. And from the session, we have a few best practices that we would like to test. And the way we are doing it is, like go bit by bit and start with it. Like the first one you're starting with is, for example, share a structure during the first training that we have with teachers for how a community of practice can be done, taking into consideration their challenges. So for example, meet once a month instead of every week, and encourage teachers that before you leave the room after the training, can you have like a simple structure of what your community of practice would look like, which is something we had not done, but organizations have said when they did this, there was a greater success. So finally, these are key takeaways for us. You're continuing to learn, and I hope that someone else is, like we can explore this together. So we found that because we've run, there was four sprints each 6 weeks, we found that being very concise in the goal and having it as a source of truth, keep referring to it like this is why we are doing this sprint, so that you don't get distracted. You can have one sprint inform the other sprint, even though you are targeting different aspects of the program, but then being very concise, so that you don't get away from your objectives or from the goal of the sprint. The other one is to consider who to learn from, so that you learn a lot in a short period of time. For example, always go to the teachers first, or go to the end users first. Then go to people who have like a lot of the information you need. For us was the communities of practice experts, those who've done it already and are doing it well. And finally, the advantage we have is that our implementation partner is very flexible and willing to use data collected over 6 months to test, see whether it works, and then test something else during the next training session in a month or something, like also. So being flexible in implementing the best practices that you see after the sprint. Yeah, so that's it. I'm looking forward to learning from anyone else who's used the lean evidence generation methods and questions and like sharings around that. Thank you. On to you, Raj.
Thank you so much, Clara. Super interesting to learn about that, the process for lean evidence generation for both the product and the problem. Yeah, curious to know whether others have used this, or have you used the Lego Serious Play methodologies? Have you worked on similar projects with communities of practices, with teachers? Please share your experiences, and I'm hoping to see some questions coming up, even from my UX colleagues on some of these really insightful talks. Also, thanks Inés for talking about the field and how to teach and build skills in empathy and curiosity. So now I'm going to talk about designing for continuous professional development. And before I talk about the agenda of my talk, I'll introduce myself. I'm not sure if any of you have ever felt this, where you forget how to talk about yourself at the beginning of a meeting. That's what this meme is for. But that's why I have some notes. So I'm Rajay. I'm a senior UX researcher at UX, and I'm based in Nairobi. I'm also leading the education vertical, and this includes curating and structuring our content on education projects, developing the capacities and experiences of our teams, including myself, within education and design projects, and working with teams to organize knowledge sharing events like this webinar. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. A little bit about my journey. I actually studied chemistry in university, and then I moved back to Nairobi, and I joined a tech company where I worked in a lab as a UX designer. I later joined ThinkPlace as a user experience, as a design researcher, and now I'm at UX. I've been at UX for 6 months now, and all throughout this time, I've really enjoyed teaching. So I've tutored chemistry and biology to high school students. I've volunteered as a teacher in different schools. I've taught English. And so learning design and education and working as a designer in education is something that allowed me to bring both of those passions together, being able to solve problems, but also sort of working around designing really engaging and effective learning experiences. So some experiences that I've had around designing for continuous professional development include the following. So the remote testing of a microlearning app for frontline workers in 4 countries, including Guatemala, India, Kenya, and Cameroon, and assessing the effectiveness of a training program for teachers in Kenya. I also worked on converting a training program that was a virtual instructor-led course into an online self-paced course. And I've also conducted some trainings for clinic staff on feedback collection and community engagement. So what I want to do is, what I've tried to do is synthesize some of the lessons I've gained from all of these experiences that both include tech and non-tech components. And I'd like to share these with you, and also love to hear about you, whether you've had any similar experiences. So this is how my talk is structured. I'll talk about scoping learning design projects. Next, about understanding your learners, and we've already got some really great stuff from Inés about on how to understand researchers and what to ask when you're in the field. And then finally, some recommendations for designers and project implementers. And this is all in the context of designing for working professionals, continuous professional development, designing for adults, which is very different to designing for students or children because of the context that they're in. So I'll start off with the scoping for a UX or a learning designer, and this is slightly more tech oriented, this specific scope, but if you're working on designing an ed tech product or an ed tech experience, whether it's an e-learning app or an online course that's self-paced, these are some of the things that you'll be asked to do, or that you will propose to do as well. So I wouldn't dwell on this too much. I'll just go through them. I know we have a lot of product people and designers here, but we've got user research, needs analysis, so understanding the needs of the learners, instructional design and content structuring, so organizing the content and making sure it goes in a logical flow, information architecture and navigation design. So again, organizing the information and how the user can find different pieces of information according to their needs. Then we have prototyping, wireframing, user flows. It can even go up to high fidelity prototyping if the UX designer has UI skills as well. Then we've got usability testing, evaluating the experiences, and collaborating with different stakeholders, the project managers, the subject matter experts, among others. But often a UX designer or learning designer will get asked to do more things. And there are a lot of things that typically get taken out of scope, and this includes the following. So there's content creation, and this is usually difficult, especially if the UX designer doesn't have that kind of knowledge. We also have graphic design and creating visual assets, the development of interactive features. So while the UX designer can do prototyping, the development actually falls under the work of the developer. And then we've got assessing the assessment and evaluation methodology. So, have the learning outcomes being met? And this usually involves the specialism or the expertise of an education researcher, even though the learning designer could help to define those outcomes, but it usually requires a more rigorous approach that takes time and needs that specific expertise. And then you also have the learning management system administration. So whether it's managing the system of like a MOOC platform or an e-learning app. And we have our friend Mark here on the right, who's unfortunately been asked to do all of these things, and he's only 22 years old. So being a designer can be stressful, especially when you're asked to do many things. I'll now talk about who else is needed to build a strong learning experience, both for tech and non-tech. So usually, if it's an app or a product or a course, you'll need the UX designer, the UI designer, developers, the system administrators, and technical support. If it's both for tech and non-tech, you'd also have a learning designer or an instructional designer, the project manager. You can have an education specialist or researcher, and the content creator or subject matter expert. So the person who has expertise in that topic that you want to relay and teach. And if it's an in-person session or a virtual instructor-led session, you'd also have trainers and facilitators for this. So now we'll talk about understanding your learners. And as we've already heard from Inés and from Clara, especially with teachers, they're in very unique contexts. They have their different responsibilities. Designing for an adult who's working is very different to designing for a student. And so these are some questions you would need to ask around this. So what level of knowledge do they have? What is their current skill level? And why are they there? Highly motivated learners will learn regardless of the quality of the learning experience, but unmotivated learners can be a challenge even for the best of instructors. So the more you can consider their motivations and attitudes, the better you can tailor the learning experience. And then for external factors, especially at least in my experience, I've learned time and time again, for working professionals, whether they're a teacher or a frontline worker, time is always a really big issue, is always a really big challenge, especially the perceived time commitment for this learning experience. Why should they prioritize this over their existing responsibilities? We've also got organizational culture. So, in some cases, staff members might be used to a more top-down environment, or where they're executing on orders. They've maybe had less opportunities to take ownership of their learning. And so if you want to build an experience that sort of enables ownership or encourages creativity, depending on their organizational culture, they may require some unlearning to be able to do that. And then, of course, what available resources do they have? What kind of devices do they use? What is their level of internet connectivity? And that can determine, what kind of formats you decide to go with. And once you have this understanding, you would then need to think about, where do you want your learners to go? But just as importantly, where do they want to go as well? I think we've maybe all had an experience where we've been forced to learn something just because it's a requirement, and that often doesn't lead to the best learning outcomes. So a question you can ask yourself is, what do you want your learners to know, do, and or value at the end of this learning experience? And then once you've mapped that out, you can think about, what are the gaps in knowledge, in skills, in motivation, or in their environment that can help this learner get to that point of success. So with knowledge, is it simply an informational gap that they have, or is it skills? And the way you can distinguish between knowledge and skills, you can ask, does the learner need to practice in order to develop proficiency? And if the answer is yes, then usually it's a skills gap. Is it motivation? There might be different reasons that they're there. If a learner has the skills and the knowledge to do something, but they aren't doing it, that's likely to be a motivation issue. And then environment, sometimes they might simply not have the right structures in place in their environment to allow them to do what they need to do. So then you can sort of take a backwards design approach, where you now are trying to get from the current state to the desired future state. This is just a slide on delivering mode considerations. So when you're designing a learning experience, you'll have a few options for different modes. This is not a scientific, but it's just a way you can think of pros and cons. So in-person training usually requires more physical resources. people. It's harder to do on a larger scale, but it offers more opportunity for social interaction. For virtual training, it works really well for distributed teams, and that's what we do a lot at UX, and requires fewer resources physically, but it does require participants to have a good internet connection and digital literacy. Then you have e-learning, which is a way to scale up, but it could be less personalized than some of the options with an instructor. And then you have blended learning, which combines best of both worlds, but it requires a lot of coordination to work well. So a big question is, should you use technology when you want to design for professional development? And the first consideration is around infrastructure and connectivity. I'll talk about a case study, and that was around the offline mode feature in a micro-learning app. So the challenge was to provide frontline workers with on-the-go guidance in the field. And a big part of it was to have content accessible offline. When we interviewed frontline staff, having an offline feature was hugely desirable. We then found an e-learning provider that had this feature. But during testing, when we evaluated the usage of it, it was almost none. There's barely any use of this. And so that's when we had to think about, okay, why, if they said that they wanted this, but then they didn't use this, what were some of the reasons? So some of the options that we thought were, lack of awareness of the feature during onboarding, confusing user experience, but also limited device capacity and performance, because for the offline feature to be used, you needed to download the lessons and the material, so it could have been used later. But the phones that most frontline staff had were more of the basic smartphones. Other considerations are, technological literacies related to the example above as well. The fact that e-learning apps can have limited opportunities for hands-on and practical learning. And another thing to think about is there's lots of systems out there. Do you want to leverage an existing platform, or do you want to build a new one? And that also depends on what resources you have available to you. Then when talking about content design and development, whether this is using tech or non-tech, something I've noticed is that often content gets developed at the HQ level, and then it gets sent out to different country offices on the ground, and then it needs to go through a process of translation or contextualization or adaptation. But a lot of the time it's not created from the ground up, and sometimes that can affect the uptake or the effectiveness of that on the ground. So some suggestions or recommendations are, when creating content in plain language to enable more accurate translation, if it includes a lot of technical terms, when it's getting translated in different languages to for other country offices, there can be multiple meanings and misunderstandings that happen as a result. Co-create content, generate locally relevant examples with staff members. Also create structures for feedback and content adaptation. So on the ground, a lot of adaptation happens organically when maybe a trainer is delivering something from a material that they got from the HQ, but rarely is rarely are those changes documented in a more structured approach. And then to manage cognitive load, convert existing content into bite-sized and digestible chunks, and use multimedia and visuals to manage cognitive load. Great. So I want to talk about motivation now, and there are two types of motivation, and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So with intrinsic motivation, usually the learner is motivated to just to learn or to solve a problem that they have, whereas an extrinsic motivation is usually motivated by having a reward or a punishment. So for a teacher, intrinsic motivation could look like, oh, I really want to use technology effectively in my classroom, or to help me manage large class sizes. But extrinsic could be, oh, I just have to go to this training because my head teacher is forcing me to go. So usually when you tap into or design for intrinsic motivation, it can often lead to better outcomes. Gamification, use it wisely. A lot of perceive gamification as throwing in leaderboards and stars and badges, but it can be used in a really subtle way. And if you can critically engage with it and really understand why you're using gamification, it can be quite successful. I also really like this model called the ARCS model of motivation. And here they talk about attention. So grabbing the attention of the learner, providing, showing how it's relevant to them, linking to their previous experience. What is it worth for them in the short term? What can they do with it now? But also what's the future usefulness of this? And then building their confidence by providing feedback, facilitating growth, as Inés talked about, with reflection, and then also, making them feel satisfied as well through rewards, making them feel tangible rewards, like consistently through the process. Then we have communication structures. I won't spend too much time on this. I know we have limited time, but generally, making sure that everything is transparent, the objectives, leveraging existing channels, providing personalized feedback, and allowing space for peer support and mentoring. On the right, we have the conversational support funnel from Intercom, which is a conversational, it's a platform where you can ask questions to people in different companies. And what they have is they have a funnel from less complex issues to more complex issues. And it starts with proactive, where you anticipate what questions that might be asked, to self-serve, like providing platforms where they can access help guides, and then human, where they actually then speak to human with a really complex question. So this sort of relieves some pressure from the experts and the trainers. And I thought this could be a nice way to think about that, even within education programs. Then we have designing with and for the supporting actors. Usually there's a whole ecosystem of actors that are required to make learning experience successful. So in the case of the frontline worker, we had the HQ, the country office manager, the content creators and subject matter experts. For the teacher, it would be the head teacher, maybe local government authorities if the teacher wanted to implement something in the school and it was an innovative idea that maybe required someone from the government to approve. And then you also had the facilitators for the in-person training. So all of these actors really need to work together to define what the value of this learning experience is, so that they can all buy into it. They can all have ownership of this, which is what the next point is about, but also to figure out where can this program be integrated into existing structures, whether it's within, for the teacher, whether it's within the school, can this be part of their existing responsibilities, or can this be adopted, on a wider scale, and make this easy for them. So provide guides and templates, for those delivering the content, or for those who are supporting the learning process. And finally, we have just a summary slide on how you can involve your learners throughout the design process. From research, you have user research, benchmarking, and competitor analysis, the needs assessment that I talked about. And then for design, a lot on co-creating, adapting and contextualizing content. If it's a text solution, user flows, information architecture, storyboarding, building prototypes. And then you have testing, where you do usability testing. And Clara's talked a lot about testing approaches for lean evidence generation. You can do observation, shadowing, and you can look at engagement metrics on the app or collect feedback through surveys. And then learning assessments, usually you need a learning specialist for that, like an education researcher. And then this is an iterative process, right? And I think everyone here has heard this tons of times. So, iterate, iterate and improve, you can go back to different steps of this process. So that wraps up my talk for this webinar. I hope that you found this useful. I'd love to hear what some of your key takeaways have been from all of us, from my talk, Clara's talk, Inés's talk. And here are some resources of where you can learn a little bit more. So some training centers, UX Academy, D-School Africa, Africa Design School. We've got some communities who have helped spread the word and who we constantly partner with different studies. UX Ghana, UX Kitchen, Dear Designer, Friends of Figma, UX Salon, and UX South Africa and Johannesburg. We've got the UX content publications. And then on the education side, just a few organizations that I've put in: EdTech Hub, EDU, UNICEF, the Aga Khan Foundation, and one book that has really been a huge help for me when I'm working on all of these different projects, and that's called Design for How People Learn by Julie Dirksen. And I would highly, highly recommend that book. So yeah, I will hand it over to our comms team, maybe Elia, who can then moderate the Q&A section.
An insightful webinar. Thank you, Inés. Thank you, Clara, for your intervention. Please feel free to drop question in the chat or open your mic to ask a question, and also give feedback. So Winnie say, really useful, Rajay. Please share your slides. We'd love to explore further with the organization you have listed. And also a comment from Uzmakan. Thanks for the wonderful insight, all three of you. I have a quick question from Inés, or any of you can answer since you have experience with focus group as well. Have you experienced groupthink as a challenge when conducting interviews in focus group? Do you follow any particular strategies to avoid the biases introduced by it? Asking because as a fellow product person, I get to conduct research with focus group very often and witness this every single time. So Inés, you want to go with that?
Yes, thanks, Elia. Thanks, Uzma, for the question. It's a very pertinent question. I've also faced challenges with focus group discussions as well. In terms of trying to get people to really say their true opinions. And yeah, groupthink is always a challenge. I'd be curious to hear what kinds of focus groups, like what kind of, people are you talking to? Is it people with like a high education level who can, read and write, or is it people who can't do that and therefore rely on speaking, because that also impacts the way people interact. But yeah, groupthink happened a lot, especially when typically there's like a dominant person who dominates the conversation, and other people are shy. So yeah, I think ways to mitigate it, I can think of a couple. So, and I'm sure maybe you do this already, but so obviously when you start your focus group discussion and you introduce yourself and the purpose of the research and why they're there and why you're asking for their help in helping you understand a certain problem or challenge, if you want to develop a product, is to set like a code of conduct, just saying, as a group, how do we want to interact with each other, and sort of get them to sort of co-create it a bit, like make sure that everyone has a voice. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no such thing as a stupid question, or there's no such thing as a stupid observation. So really trying to set the grounds for that sort of psychological safety. At the same time, you don't know also, like, because maybe groupthink is already because people know each other. Like, there's all these different dynamics among people that we don't know as researchers. So that's also what can be influencing the groupthink. But yeah, if you set those foundations from the beginning, that can be a strategy. Another strategy also is doing like activities within the focus group. So there's this thing called deviation from the norm, where you like you're in a room and you say, okay, give me an example, or like if you agree or disagree, you know, you do like agree or disagree statements, and like agree is to one side of the room and disagree is to the other side of the room, and get to stand wherever they think. That is also a way of giving them space to actually want to maybe be a bit more brave in terms of really expressing their opinion and going where the crowd goes. Lastly, if this is people who really, you know, they know how to read and write, they can write on Post-its or whatever, it can be interesting to maybe start with some individual activities, like, you know, can you brainstorm for 2 minutes individually whatever you want to know, and that forces people to just have their own ideas and, you know, not copy each other. And then you could say, oh, and then we share, you know, in twos, and then yeah, so you can sort of integrate different activities within the same focus group discussion. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to continue the conversation afterwards through LinkedIn or wherever, emails. So yeah, anyway, I hope that was useful. Uzma.
So Usman, I hope that she did answer to your question. I've seen that you follow up with saying that my target segment for focus group mostly include teachers of early years and primary grade in Pakistan. So I think there's another question.
Yes, we have a question from Camille.
And one from Fikayo. Okay, go ahead, Gloria.
Okay, let me start with Camille. Camille say, I'm curious. Rajay mentioned the other specialties to involve in design for education. From the speaker's perspectives, are there in the education system that understand design best? Maybe this question is for Clara. Were there any specific challenges working with teachers? Clara, you want to go on this?
Yeah, I can. Thank you, Camille. I think she's referring specifically to the question about teachers. Although I can mention briefly about other specialities I found interesting working with in designing for education. I find game designers. Some of my colleagues are former game designers or have worked in game design companies and human-centered design. I'm seeing Winnie here with my colleague, and is a human-centered design expert. For challenges working with teachers, I think there's a very broad spectrum of teachers in Kenya based on the resources available to them. So teachers, for example, in Nairobi, which is more resourced county, and teachers in Kwale and Kilifi, where the project I talked about is based, have quite different challenges. So I think the spectrum, that's one of the things that I've found is a big difference. So you go to a new region, you go with a beginner's mindset, what Inés was saying, and you don't say, I've worked in Kenya, and so like I know how to work with teachers. So that has been interesting to learn, and I think the opportunity with teachers is that they're willing to learn, they're open. I mean, again, spectrum based on the age group of the teachers. You find that all the teachers near retirement and all these things you're introducing and trying to help them adopt might not be very interested in, but the younger teachers are open, and I mean, I think there's a learning process, but those are some of the things I've noticed.
Thank you very much, Clara. Camille, does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, awesome. Tracy, if you don't mind, can I just share a question from Fikayo, and then we can go over your question. So that's a question for the whole group, I think. So Fikayo say, Clara, learning sprint sounds so interesting. I'm curious about its applicability in service design. Just thinking that gains in service design sometimes have really long time horizon, but being able to structure. Oh, sorry, that was not the question. Sorry. Just a minute. Sorry. Oh, so here's the question. Thank you so much. This was really insightful. I'm curious, how are you three thinking about designing to accommodate learning disabilities? Is it something you are intentional about, or or are your processes automatically integrate this? Do your processes automatically integrate this?
I can jump into that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fikai, for that question. I've actually worked in disability inclusion projects, not specifically directly applied to the education space, but more specifically directed at how in different disability inclusive practices. So to give you an example, how to make providers like, nurses, for example, or medical staff who provide sexual and reproductive health and family planning services, how to make them more disability inclusive. So I have been involved in designing packages to sort of train these service providers for disability inclusion, and in getting them to motivated to accommodate their way of providing their services in a more disability inclusive. Some people, they think I'm so overloaded, and like how do you get them to really care? I think that's the big challenge, and I think it's linked to the models that Rajay was sharing as well, in terms of the ARCS model, and the motivation. It's super interesting and important to tap into the motivation for people to really want to accommodate for learning disabilities. Not sure if that answered the question, but in my work.
Tracy, over to you. I think you can open your mic and ask your question if you want. I see you have raised your hand.
So hi everyone, thank you so much for a very informative session on conducting effective user research, especially for small kids, because I understand that small kids actually have a shorter attention span, or they're driven by words, or like they're motivated by what they're getting after the research, or the power dynamic where they feel where there's a teacher or an elderly person, they have to act a certain way or certain things in order for them to sound correct. So such a group, like effective methods that you usually use to conduct this research with that group, or like active, or are they even actively involved in the entire research process?
Or is it addressed to the three speakers?
Yeah, so I think Rajay will be in the best position to answer that, and Clara as well. because from their presentation, it seems they have worked with on such projects.
Sorry, just to clarify, was your question around how to conduct user research with children?
Yes, my question was that.
Okay, I think Clara, you have experience in that, right? So you might be better suited to answer that question than me.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Tracy. I'll respond for both projects that I presented, for the app, for the learning game, and eventually the animated series. We mostly did observations with children because we were working with children between 4 and 8. 4-year-old is very young to even like understand what's going on. So we just like observe them playing, and ask, why did you not tap that? Why did you, or what did you like about what you saw? Very informal questions, not structured interviews. And you know, they would say like, I like the character, or I don't like that sound, or I don't understand what they're saying, and so would, you know, like change based on like simple, what looks like a conversation with the child, but was a very like serious like research process with the conversations with children. So it was never like a list of questions where you're writing down. It was like very conversational, and I think it also helped that we were testing games and testing videos. So the conversations were with something that's fun. At the moment, with the more like class-based research project, we are doing focus group discussions and actually quite struggling to work with children in lower grades, grade 1 to 3, to make them identify what learning through play with technology activities the teacher used and whether they do them often. So we find that it's hard for learners of this age to understand what you're saying. It was lesson different. It was just a normal lesson for me. But with the older children, you can hold focus group discussions that are helpful, but then an informal conversation, like warming up to them and just finding out the kind of I think again, my Kiswahili is not as good as coastal Kiswahili, or not, the accent is different, so maybe that's something that distracts the children. So that's something we are still learning, how to better work with the younger children in this form of research. I hope that's helpful, Tracy. We can speak if you have a specific project that you're working on. We can talk about how you can try out the research.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Clara. I think you've answered my question. I'm actually looking to work on a project that involves small kids, and like it's basically to help them refrain from having sugary snacks, or like just trying to get them to have more like healthy habits when it comes to snacking. So, but I've tried just interacting with my nephew and to see how he behaves, and I feel like I'm not really able to get a lot of information from him. So I was wondering if there was a way I could go around to get more information from such a group, or to involve other parties or like have other resources that will also help me in having an effective research.
So I'd say focus group discussions, teachers and parents, those might be the most useful tools to other stakeholders to use. But also like focus group discussions, talking to children in a group is like they just will have a conversation and almost forget you're there if you're slick enough. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
The last question from Kalama, and the question is for Inés. So he's asking, what does the recruitment of local researchers look like for you? What are the interesting criteria to take into account?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. So my experience, having worked with like young researchers who don't have any formal training to like really expert researchers, I find the best researchers, like the best criteria is number one, to focus on their soft skills. So because that's going to make your life easier and it's going to make them learn faster. So something important for a researcher to have is willingness to learn, someone who's proactive, you know, who's also a problem solver. Like if you're in the field and someone doesn't want to talk, well then maybe we ask someone else, or you know, or they introduce themselves in like a very sort of friendly manner. They're there being proactive. Someone who's a player, you know, thinks about the team, will stay later if necessary. I mean, obviously it's not ideal, but yeah, you want people who are there to be together in the team to help you. Someone who is empathetic and someone who listens. I think those are the basic soft skills. And in terms of hard skills, as long as they know how to take notes, how to write, you know, summarize their notes during interviews, I think that's one basic hard skill. Another hard skill is their fluency. So they need to be ideally as bilingual as possible, you know, in the in-country language and in the language of the community where you're working, plus, you know, whatever, if it's English or if it's French or Portuguese, or, you know, to work with people. I mean, ideally, I'd love to speak every single language in the world so I don't need to have a translator. But yeah, that's also key for them to be able to translate whatever your participants are saying. In terms of, yeah, so I find younger people who are a little bit more inexperienced but have like a good sort of willingness to learn attitude tend to be better researchers, just because they're more open to adopting, you know, the sort of research techniques that you're showing them. Whereas older, more expert researchers, in my experience, it's sort of a bit difficult to change their ways. Like even though they're in a human-centered design research process, they'll tend to stick to their old ways of doing things. So that can be a bit tricky sometimes, especially if they're used to being very formal, you know, and also dressing up with shirts and looking sort of important. That can also be intimidating. So yeah, well, on the other hand, they can also be useful because they can also take notes and they can sort of be your thought partner. So I think it's striking that balance. But I'd say top things to look out for are the two basic skills of, like the two hard skills of taking notes and fluency in languages, and the soft skills. Because I think the rest sort of is easy to learn once you're in the field with them. I hope that answers your question.
Answer. And Sasha has another question. She's asking where do you find this local researcher? Are there any specific platform you use to scout for them?
You're asking me a very secret question. Okay, full disclosure, I was actually never involved in recruitment, just because, yeah, I was never part of that, because we had a mobilizer at Think Place, and so he was the one who was responsible for recruiting people. But usually, yeah, I've never used any platforms. Usually it can be through your client. So if you're working for a client and they have a program in, I don't know, Kenya, and you're going to a county in Kenya where they are, asking them to ask their networks if they have a local presence there. So that's, yeah, leveraging on the networks of your clients, the networks of your organization, your own personal networks. It's very much mouth to mouth. I mean, I'd love to have access to a platform. Maybe that exists already, but yeah, I don't have the answer to, yeah, I don't have like a formal place that I go to. It's always through network and word of mouth, unfortunately. But if anyone knows of any platform, please do share with us.
Yeah, there's also LinkedIn, but I guess that's not the easiest platform to use either for this recruitment.
Please, hand risen. You can open your mic for your question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I have enjoyed the session greatly, and I'm learning a lot, even though it's not my first time for being part of UX activity online, but I have learned greatly. I just want to comment on the last question that Inés was trying to make comment on. I think research organization or research design companies can actually help in recruitment process, in the sense that if you use your local networks to recruit for you, it will be influenced by biases. From my background or where I'm coming from, you observe that your local networks would always look
I think we lost you.
For people who they know. Regarding my advice, if a design activity in the field, you can identify people who you have trained, people who have been following your webinars, your training, your activities, and still include them as part of the research team. It's like a rewarding system. It helps encourage people to be motivated. It's an incentive system. You have a project in a certain environment. Identify who have been participating in your activities. Do they have the relevant skill? Are they passionate about it? You can make them part of the local research team as long as they have the competency and they have been part of your activities online. That would inspire, that would also motivate, because from what I have seen and I have known in the research industry is that if you rely on your networks, those who have been faithful in following you, participating in your activities, sometimes will be left out, even though I think that could be like a time for them to be rewarded. Thank you. I don't know if I'm making sense, but this is just what I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Also, can I respond to that, Elia, quickly? Also, I think you have a great point in terms of, yeah, if you rely on your networks, you're always going to sort of get the sort of usual suspects, and maybe it's I don't know, only people who have access to university will be the ones getting opportunities. So I definitely think it's important to go beyond your networks. But I do believe networks, some people have access to different kinds of communities, whether it's income levels or different geographic locations. They tend to be connectors. So I think it's about identifying those connectors to sort of really connect you to sort of the last mile people, so that you go beyond the usual suspects when it comes to recruitment of local researchers. And I really do personally believe like it's also a super important opportunity to go, to a place and you do an assignment, but also to leave that legacy behind, that you build someone's capacity for like a week or 2 weeks. And again, it's not necessarily someone with formal training. So yeah, I think it's definitely important to have that scoping work before you recruit, so to lay the ground. As I said, we have a mobilizer he's kind of like our in-house like streetwise guy who just talks to anyone. He'll talk to like the boda drivers, the motor taxi drivers, and then he'll go and have food in the Mama Kibanda's place, and then just get talking to people, or going to church, or sort of going into different spaces to really go beyond the networks. But yeah, I totally agree with you also, and you made a lot of sense. So thanks for raising that super important point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining and for coming. I know we went a little bit overboard. Really grateful for all those who could stay till the end. Thank you, Rajay. Thank you, Inés, and thank you, Clara, for your intervention. It was really insightful. As a non-UX researcher and designer, I really learned a lot from you guys, so I'm very grateful for that. We'll be sending everybody through email a survey so you can give us your feedback on this webinar, and we hope to see you on the next event that we have. Thank you very much. And also you can follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter to have more information. Thank you, guys. And I'll let Rajay wrap up.
Oh no, I think you did a great job of that, Elias. Thank you so much. Just again, a shout out to our communication partners, Education Design Unlimited, the Aga Khan Foundation, and huge kudos as well to the UX Academy team for bringing all this together, for pushing me to make sure I was organized to, deliver on this webinar and coordinate with our speakers. So yeah, thank you everyone, and biggest thanks to you guys for your participation and questions during this session. So stay tuned for the activities that David mentioned coming up for the rest of the year, and yeah, looking forward to engaging with you all again soon. Thank you so much.